Hey guys, just near JHart Modelworks coming to you with the next installment on the 69 Mustang Restomod. In this video, we're going to be tackling the glass as well as finishing off the upper half of the interior. We're going to get the interior, the chassis, and the body mated together. We're going to wrap up the chassis and suspension, and we may even finish off the engine bay. So got a lot planned. Let's go ahead and get the camera flipped around and get to work. First thing we need to do is remove the headlight lenses from the center of our glass. I hate the Revell does it this way. This may be a monogram thing, but either way, it results in an ugly hole in the ceiling that we're going to have to address later. We also need to remove the glass from the rest of the clear sprue. I'm going to use my razor saw to cut this wide sprue point without putting a lot of stress on the glass, resulting in a big white area. We're then going to clean up the edges with some sandpaper. And then we need to start masking. We're going to place our tape on the outside of the rear quarter windows, and then we're going to mark off with a pen or a marker where those windows are at. Now we want to cut out our masks. But we're going to apply them to the inside of the glass on the opposite side of the car. We're doing this as we're going to be painting the inside of the glass. And we'll repeat those steps on the other side. And now we want to make masks for the front and rear windshield. For really wide stuff like this, I like to use this light purple Scotch brand delicate surface tape. I get this from Home Depot or Lowe's, and it's a really low tack painter's tape designed for masking over paint. From what I can tell, it's essentially a really wide roll of washi tape, similar to what Tamiya is made out of, without that Tamiya price tag. As you can see, we're going to lay it on the outside, and then we're going to trim off the sides to make it just a little easier to work with. Then again, we want to mark off the window area from the outside. To make this easier to line up, we're going to draw a center line. We want to use some digital calipers, and we're going to measure from the two corners at the top. We can then divide that by 2, set the calipers and lock them into place, and then make a spot at the center of the windshield. We're going to repeat that process on the bottom 2 corners as well. And then when we place a straight edge along the 2 points we just made, we can draw a straight line down the very center of our tape. Now, to make this easier to line up when we put this on the inside, we're going to make a couple of marks based on that center line on the inside of the glass. We then want to place a small dot where the mirror mount point is at. Now we want to trim away the excess from the outside of our mask, and we're also going to use a drill bit to drill a small hole where we put that pin mark at for the mirror post. Now we want to apply the mask to the inside of the glass. We're going to line up our center line with the marks that we made in the center, and we're going to slide the post through the hole we made, and then we're going to smooth it out from the center to the edges of the glass. The process for the rear window is pretty much exactly the same. We simply don't have a mirror to deal with. And now that we no longer leave the marks, we're going to use some UMP airbrush cleaner or some IPA to clean the marker off the glass. This works really well without damaging the clear plastic. We also want to put a bit of tape over that mirror post. We're going to paint that separately later. We don't want to risk any paint bleeding under our tape around that post. Now we're going to apply some Tamiya tape across the top of the glass. We're going to apply this in several overlapping strips. In theory, I could have used the delicate surface tape here as well. I probably should have. It probably would have worked better, but in the end, this works out just fine. We're going to trim the edges up and we're going to mark out the front and rear of the top section of the glass. This is going to be the template for our headliner. We'll then cut out our template and we're going to apply it to some clear acetate sheet. I'm using this instead of regular sheet plastic because it's a thinner plastic. It's the thinnest plastic I have. We don't want a deep ridge along the edges. We want this to blend in with the clear plastic surface as best as we can. We then want to trim the plastic along our template and then we'll remove the mask. Now we want to use a straight edge like a thin metal ruler and we're going to lay it as straight as possible across the headliner. And then we're going to fold the headliner up to form the creases that will recreate the seams in the headliner material. From here, we want to carefully glue the headliner into place inside the glass using some Bob Smith Super Gold Plus. This is a non-fuming CA glue that is safe for clear parts and it doesn't haze them up like regular super glue will. You could use canopy glue or PVA glue for this as well, but they will take a lot longer to cure up. And with the headliner having bends in it, it will be very difficult to get it to lay down straight while that glue sets. Just be careful not to get any glue on the glass where it will be visible. I've hit the glass with some Tamiya LP15 IJ in gray, just like we used on the interior. I've also removed the tape and painted that little mirror post as well. We want to very carefully remove all of our masking tape. And then we can glue the glass in place with some more Super Gold Plus. There are two small mount points at the front and one in the back. I also want to hit the four corners with just a little bit more glue just to be safe. And then we need to line up and seat the glass, making sure we get all three mount points seated firmly while not getting any glue on the glass itself. This is easier said than done now that we can't see through the plastic. We'll then press and hold it until it sets, and this glue does take a little bit longer to set than normal CA glue. The paint on the mirror post did not cover nearly as well as I had hoped, so we're just going to touch it up with our paint markers. The kit's rearview mirror was warped and absolutely terrible, and then I lost it. So I went off and 3D designed up a new one, and I printed it off. There is a small hole in the back, and this fits right on that post. We're going to add just a tiny touch of Super Gold Plus into that hole on the mirror, and then we're going to set it into place on the post. Make sure you give it just a slight twist towards the driver's side of the car, as in reality the rearview mirror never points straight back, it's always tilted just slightly towards the driver. I also 3D printed up a set of my sun visors. Now these are available on my Cults 3D store, and every now and then I need to make a new set with a different shape. When I do, I add those into this same file, so if you've already bought these in the past, you can re-download it and you get the new ones for free. We're just going to add a little bit of CA glue here on the sun visors, and we're going to carefully set them into place. We're going to glue the other sun visor in the exact same way. And we want to be careful to make sure that they kind of line up with each other and they're fairly even across the front of the car. Now that front edge of the headliner doesn't really line up with the front edge of the roof, but that's okay because the sun visors cover it up so no one will ever tell. The kit instructions say to put the taillights in much later. But because we already attached the rear valance while doing the body work, we need to get the taillights in now or we won't be able to get them in once the chassis is installed. The taillights themselves have a small arrow. When you install these, that arrow should point up. Now we're going to apply some CA glue to the trim on the top and bottom of the taillights. There is a lot of extra trim here. There's plenty of room for glue. And then we're going to set those taillights carefully into place. Be careful and check frequently to make sure you don't have any glue on your fingers that you might get on the body. We're going to repeat that for the other side. And that takes care of the taillights. Those look really good too. Now we need to glue in the interior tub, and since this is going to be really close to our glass, we're using the Super Gold Plus again. We want to run a small bead right along the bottom edge of the firewall and hit the mounting post in the back as well. Then we want to insert our tub by sliding it in from the rear wheel well. We're going to line up the front edge and line up the rear locating hole with the mounting post, and then carefully drop it into place with as little wiggling around as possible. Once we get the rear seated, we want to make sure the front edge is flush and hold it until the glue sets. If this doesn't line up correctly and it doesn't seat all the way into place, we could have problems seating the chassis here shortly. We're going back to our Insecure here, and we're going to apply a little bit of glue along this flat edge and put a little bit in the hole for the strut mount area. Then we'll just drop it into place and press it up against the side of the engine bay until it sets. Then we're going to repeat that process for the other side as well. So to seat the chassis, we want to start by sliding the rear into place from the rear wheel well. We then want to drop the chassis down along the sides and then gently press the front in behind the front valance until it clicks into place. Once we know that it's going to seat properly, we're going to go ahead and pull the front back out, and we're going to apply a little bit of CA glue to the undersides of the front of the engine bay walls. Now, once again, we'll just gently press the chassis back in and get it past the front valance, and we're going to hold it in place until the glue sets. Again, we want to be very careful. We're going to check our fingers constantly because this is one of those areas where you can get glue on your fingers. And we're going to do a quick test fit just to make sure that the hood sits nice and flush. Next, we're going to add some CA glue to the 4 mounting holes on the chassis for the exhaust. We'll then carefully set the 4 mount posts into these holes. With everything in place, it's a lot harder to see the mounting holes on the chassis, and I did have to fiddle with it quite a bit, but we need to make sure that the posts sit correctly or the exhaust won't sit straight and flush with the chassis. Now we want to add some glue to our 4 mounting holes for the rear suspension. Now I was out of frame for this, but I installed our modified drive shaft into the rear axle with no glue. We don't need it. Then we will slide the whole assembly in between the exhausts, and we're going to get the front pin to seat into the transmission. Once it's in, the leaf springs should just drop right into place. Again, the rear mounting holes are hard to see, and you need to make sure that the leaf springs sit all the way into all 4 holes, or you're going to have uneven wheels in the next video. We have some rear shocks that are very similar to the fronts. We'll add some glue to this flat edge on the mount and then to the end of the shock where it sets into the chassis. We're going to drop the shock into its hole and then line that flat edge up against the leaf spring. You can see there's a slight little notch where that mount plate fits perfectly. And again, we're going to repeat it for the other side, but keep in mind that the hole for the other side is on the opposite side of the rear axle. One is in the front and the other is behind. Now I made a little mess with the CA glue there, totally my fault. So I'm going to carefully sand it smooth, and then we're going to touch the mount up with the black acrylic paint marker. These things are becoming crazy useful. They are a little shiny, but they dry flat eventually. And that is going to wrap up the chassis work for this video. Before we can start working on the engine bay, we need to assemble some things first, starting with our 3D printed Optima battery. Using Lychee Slicer, I created some holes in the top of the battery right in front of the battery terminals. They go in through the top and they come out at an angle in the bottom. We're going to run some 32 gauge red wire through this first one. This is going to be our positive line. And then we're going to run some 32 gauge black on the other side for our negative. I also created some holes in the top of the battery itself. These are slightly larger and they line up with the exit holes at the bottom of the top of the battery. So we're just going to add some glue to the top. Got a little carried away there, so we're going to scrape some of that off. And now we want to insert our wires into the holes in the battery and then slide the top into place, and it should glue down and hold everything together. Of course, I've printed out some Optima battery decals, and we're going to use the ridiculously expensive Micromark hole punch to cut them out. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to take your decal and slide it between the plastic and the metal plates, and you're just going to figure out which one of these best fits the circle that you're trying to cut out. Now I could probably use the one below here. This is the exact fit, but I kind of want to make sure that I don't knock out any of the decal itself. I'm going to go ahead and use this larger one, as the white outer area of the decal sheet is going to blend in with the body itself. We just got to figure out which one of these is the right pin. Get that pin in place on top of our decal, and then smack it with a hammer. And we end up with a perfectly circular decal. Now we want to put these back up as soon as you are done with them, as they are super easy to lose, especially the small ones, and Micromark doesn't sell replacement pins. I actually ended up having to buy some stainless steel rod off of Amazon in the correct sizes and hand cut these using a hacksaw to replace, because I lost about 3 of the tiny ones. Applying the decals is pretty much the same as every other decal. You dip them into some nice hot water, then you lose the footage applying some microset and applying the decal, and then you skip forward to the part where you just nudge it around a whole lot to get it into place. Once you have the decal where you want it, you come back in with a cotton bud and you tap away any excess moisture and solution, knock it out of position again, and then spend some more time repositioning it with a cotton bud. In case you couldn't tell, decals are not my favorite part of model building, so we're going to do another one on the top. Now we're going to go ahead and use the silver display marker, and we're going to detail paint up the terminals. We're then going to follow that up with some Vallejo Model Air Black and some Vallejo Mecha Color Red and our mechanical pencil, and we're just going to tap in some colored covers over the areas where there would be screw down terminal locations. There's a set of screw down terminals up here at the top, and then there's also a set here on the front. We're going to come in here and do our black covers as well. And our battery is looking pretty sharp and ready to go. For a more modernized look, we've 3D printed up a modern brake booster and master cylinder. We're going to do a little bit of detailing and assembly on these. We're going to start by painting the bottom of the master cylinder silver, since I just left it all black. Too bad the stupid camera is busy focusing on that bowl of water. We're going to add a little CA glue to the end of the master cylinder and slot it into place in our brake booster. We want to make sure it seats straight and flush so it doesn't sit at an odd angle in the car. This is some 30 gauge wire that I got on Amazon to do spark plug wires with, but it's too big. It doesn't fit in any of the wire looms. So I pretty much don't use it, but we're going to go ahead and strip some, and we're going to use it to plumb the brake lines into our master cylinder. Now the master cylinder has mount points in here. We're going to go ahead and drill a hole through them. Let's go ahead and drill the other one out while we're at it. Now rather than getting glue on the wire and then trying to get it lined up and getting glue all over the part, what we're going to do is push the wire all the way through the hole. We're then going to add glue to the wire on the other side, and then we're going to pull it back through so that it just disappears inside the master cylinder. This way we don't get a lot of glue everywhere. We're going to go ahead and repeat that on the other wire as well. And then it's just a matter of trimming them off, bending them down, and getting them so they disappear into the engine bay. And that should do it. The next item to take care of is our radiator assembly. Now, the kit comes with this big fan shroud, and this is meant to go around a pulley-driven fan for the engine. Now, this being a modern Coyote engine, it doesn't have a pulley-driven fan, so we need to add in some electric fans. So, of course, I 3D printed up a dual electric fan and some fan blades. So we're going to start by gluing our fans into our fan housing. We're just going to drop these into place like this. So the radiator has these two notches on the bottom which line it up with the engine bay, and we want to make sure that our fan doesn't stick up past the top. So we're going to just take some glue and we're going to add it onto these side bits here where the other fan housing would have mounted. And then we're going to carefully set this into place. We want to make sure that we get everything nice and straight and even, and we don't stick out anywhere. Now we're going to get some glue down on those mount points at the bottom, and then I'm going to add some all over this radiator area, which isn't going to matter because the radiator never actually touches those areas. So we're going to add a little bit to the very top of the inside half of the radiator here, and then carefully slide it into place. Now we're going to add a little bit of glue to the top of the radiator as well as to the radiator core support. And we're going to glue the top of our radiator into place. Once it's there, we just want to go ahead and fiddle with it to make sure everything is nice and straight and sits perfectly flush. Now we have our oil cooler, and contrary to my original belief, that little lip goes to the bottom, not the top. So we're going to re-glue the part, getting some glue on the actual top, and then we're going to fight to make sure that the top lines up flush, as the only support is a bar running down the very center of the back, which lets it wobble around. Now that our components are all complete, we can start assembling the engine bay, starting with putting a little glue on the back of the master cylinder, and we're going to mount this. It flush mounts against that wall because we had to modify this, so we want to make sure that we get the master cylinder perfectly straight up and down. We don't want it pointing up or down or laying tilted off to the side. Now we need to make sure that the upper strut brace is going to clear this master cylinder. It should be good, but it's always a good idea to test fit this. And yeah, that looks like that's going to be just fine. Now we're going to put some glue over here on our battery shelf, and we're going to glue the battery down into place. We're going to trim off our excess negative wire, and we're going to tuck that in the back towards the back of the engine block. Now we're going to tuck our positive line down through the side of the engine and pull it all the way through the chassis. And we're going to line that up and trim the excess off. And then we're going to glue that into place back behind the starter. Now we're going to make some radiator hoses. We're going to start with some 26 gauge black wire. We're going to strip the very end off just to give us a little bit that we can glue into place later. And then it's just a series of stubbing this into place, figuring out where we want to bend, make a bend, test fit it, make another bend, test fit it again, and just keep repeating that process until you get it to the shape that you want and so that it lines up with where you want it to hit on the radiator. Once we've got it where we want it, we're going to go ahead and add a little glue on both ends, and we're going to glue the stripped end into the water pump. That is after we drop it through the engine bay and then go find it again. And the flat end is just going to butt up to the lower portion of the radiator because the kit doesn't have a lower radiator hose with the original engine, and it doesn't have any mount points for a lower radiator hose. Now that the lower hose is done, we need to make an upper hose. And the way this water pump sits, it's going to have to go down, then come up, and then curve and go into the hole on the radiator for the original hose. So once again, I'm going to do a ton of test fitting and bending and test fitting and bending again until we get the shape that we need. Now we're going to trim off our excess. We're going to do one final test fit just to make sure everything sits exactly where we want it to go. Once we're sure it's going to sit exactly where we want it to, we're going to put some glue on the end that connects to the water pump. We're going to glue it into place and seat the other end inside the radiator and let that cure up. We're not gluing the radiator end in yet. Once it's cured up, then we'll take the radiator end back out of the radiator. We're going to add a little bit of glue, and then we're going to push it back in the hole in the radiator to sit into place. Now that we're done with the radiator, we're going to move on to the strut braces. We're going to add a little glue right here to these mount points at the top of the firewall. And then we're going to add another bit of glue right here on the fender. And then we will carefully set these into place. We're going to repeat that process to glue in the passenger side strut brace. And about a day after finishing these, we're going to realize that we messed up and didn't glue our oil check stick in place in the engine first. So off camera, I'm actually going to break off the driver's side strut brace and glue that into place later. So it turns out we're not as finished with the radiator as I thought we were. Small Crate Details does some fantastic oil caps, which also work really good as radiator caps. So we're going to go ahead and cut one of these off the fret. We're going to add a little bit of super glue on top of that terrible oil cap there. And we're going to glue this right into place on top of the radiator. We're also going to drill a hole. I think this is a 0.6 millimeter. We're drilling it right at the very top of the radiator, right underneath where that cap is at for an overflow. Now we should have drilled this before we painted everything. So we're going to come back in with a black display paint marker and touch up the mark where our drill bit bit into it. We're going to take some 0.5 millimeter steel wire and we're going to put a small 90-degree bend in it where the overflow comes out of the radiator. We're going to roughly measure out to the far end and we're going to put another 90 going down where the overflow will run down beside the radiator and disappear into the engine bay. We're going to put a little bit of CA glue on the end of the overflow. We're going to tuck it into the hole that we drilled and carefully set it down into place. It may take a little fiddling, but we want to make sure that everything sits flush and square. Alright guys, so that is a wrap for this video. We got a lot done in this one too. The glass is in, it's super clean, our interior is completely finished top to bottom, everything is mated up, our chassis and suspension are done with the exception of the brakes and wheels, which we'll take care of near the very end in the final video. The engine bay is complete with the exception of the air filter. I need to figure out how I'm going to do this. I'm probably going to end up 3D modeling up a custom air duct with a 90 coming out of that throttle body that'll duct it over here into the side and tuck that air filter down into this large open area here. And I think that's going to work out for us. Let's do one more quick test fit of the hood and make sure it still sits properly. Yep, that looks good. Nothing's interfering there at all. So yeah, from this point, all we're looking at is final assembly stuff. Mirrors, door handles, bumpers, headlights, all the little finishing touches around the car like that. So thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I always appreciate you coming by and building with me, and I'll catch you on the next one.